I prepared Christmas dinner for my son and daughter-in-law. I gave him a new car and her a designer purse. When it was their turn to give a gift, he said, "My wife told me to teach you a lesson, so no gifts." My daughter-in-law just stood there smiling. I pulled an envelope out of my bag. "Perfect. Then I have one more gift for you both. But before I tell you what was in that envelope, you need to understand how we got there. Because none of it started on Christmas Eve. It started years before that, in the slow, quiet way that damage always does, one small thing at a time, until you look around one day and realize the life you built looks nothing like the one you're standing in. My name is Margaret, though everyone who matters calls me Maggie. I'm 65 years old. I have lived in the same house for 31 years. My husband Gerald and I bought it in the spring when Dan was still small enough to ride on Gerald's shoulders, small enough to fall asleep in the car and need to be carried inside without waking. We chose it because of the big maple in the backyard and the kitchen window that faced east, and because Gerald said it felt like a place where things could grow. Gerald died 4 years ago. A heart attack, fast and without warning, the way those things sometimes happen when you least expect them and are least prepared. We were supposed to have more time. We were supposed to retire together, travel, sit on the back porch and watch the maple change colors every fall without worrying about anything more serious than what to have for dinner. Instead, I learned how to sleep on one side of the bed. I learned how to cook for one and how to keep myself busy enough not to feel the quiet too deeply. I learned all the things you learn when the person who was supposed to be there isn't anymore. Dan handled the grief in his own way. He called more in the first few months, came by on Sundays, helped me with things around the house that Gerald used to handle, the yard, the gutters, the stubborn garage door that needed a specific kind of patience to coax into working. I was grateful for every bit of it, not just for the help, but for the company, for proof that the family hadn't disappeared along with Gerald. He met Claire about a year after his father died. I was glad for him, genuinely. I knew he had been lonely in the way young men sometimes are when they're between things, between the life they had and the life they're still building. He brought her to Sunday dinner in October, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and smiled warmly and asked questions about the photographs on the wall. She seemed curious. She seemed present. She seemed like someone who wanted to be here. I liked her that first evening. I want to be honest about that. I liked her, and I told Dan afterward that she seemed lovely, and I meant it. Whatever came later, that part was real. The first year was easy. Claire came to holidays and brought wine and helped clear the table without being asked. She remembered small things, the way Gerald took his coffee, a story I'd told once about a trip Dan and I took when he was 9. She had a good memory, and she used it in a way that felt warm rather than calculated, or at least that's how it seemed at the time. They got married in June of the following year. Small ceremony, just family and close friends at a venue about 40 minutes outside of town. Dan looked the way fathers hope their sons will look on their wedding day, a little stunned, deeply happy, like he couldn't quite believe the day had actually arrived. I danced with him after dinner, and he held on a little longer than the song required, and neither of us said anything about Gerald, but we both felt him there. I drove home that night and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and let myself feel something that felt almost like wholeness, like the family was going to be okay. I did not know then what the next 2 years would look like. It's difficult to say exactly when things started to change because changes like that don't announce themselves. They accumulate. One small shift leads to another, and before long the direction has changed completely, and you're somewhere you never intended to be, and you're not entirely sure how you got there. The first thing I noticed was the house comments. They began sometime in the second year of their marriage, not long after they moved into a rental together in the city. The rent was high, and I knew they found it stressful. Dan had mentioned it a few times, not complaining, just stating it the way you state facts when something weighs on you. I understood. Rents were unreasonable. Starting out was hard. Gerald and I had struggled too in the early years, and I remembered what that felt like. But what began as vague comments about their own situation gradually shifted into something more pointed. Claire would walk through my house during visits and let her eyes move over things in a particular way, not admiringly, assessingly, the way you look at something when you're trying to calculate its value. It started small. She said once, standing in my living room, that the house had so much potential. The way she said potential, it landed strangely, like a word that should have been a compliment but somehow wasn't. I let it go. Then it was the maintenance. "You must spend so much keeping this place up," she said another time, running a hand along the kitchen counter. "All these old houses, something's always breaking. Isn't it exhausting?" I said I managed fine. She smiled and nodded, and the subject moved on. By the third visit with that energy, she was using the word downsizing. Have you ever thought about it? A nice condo somewhere. No yard to worry about, no gutters, less everything. You could really simplify your life at this stage, Maggie. I told her calmly that I wasn't at a stage where I needed to simplify anything, that I liked my yard and my gutters and my house and had no plans to leave it. She tilted her head slightly and said, of course, just a thought." But it was never just a thought. That was what I began to understand as the months went on. It was always the same thought, returned to in a different outfit, a different angle of approach. She was patient about it in a way that felt deliberate. Dan was different during this period too, not dramatically different, not in a way that would be obvious to someone who didn't know him well, but I knew him. I had watched him grow from a boy who cried over scraped knees into a man who held himself together through his father's funeral without breaking until he was in the car on the way way home. I knew the particular way his face looked when he was uncomfortable and pretending not to be. I knew the silence he used when he didn't want to say something he'd been told to say. He started asking about the house too, not as often as Claire, and never with the same smooth persistence. His version was more halting, more apologetic. He asked me once if I had ever looked into reverse mortgages. Another time he mentioned a senior living community that had opened near the highway, said it seemed really nice actually, said some people loved the social aspect of it. I asked him point blank whether Claire had put him up to saying that, and he got quiet in that particular way and said he was just thinking about my future. I let that one settle, and then I said clearly and calmly that my future was in the house where his father and I raised him, and that I expected both of them to respect that. He nodded and looked relieved, like part of him had been hoping I'd push back hard enough that he wouldn't have to bring it up again. But Claire was not so easily discouraged. There was a dinner in early October, about 3 months before Christmas, where things shifted into a register I could no longer explain away. They had come over on a Tuesday evening, nothing special, just dinner. I made roast chicken and potatoes and a salad, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we always did. Dan talked about work. I asked Claire about the boutique. Normal things. Easy things. Then Claire set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized as rehearsed, the kind of expression you practice before you use it, and said, "Maggie, I want to talk to you seriously about the house." Dan shifted in his seat. I waited. She said she and Dan had been looking into their options, and the reality was that with what this property was worth, there were ways for everyone to benefit. Ways for Dan and her to get out from under their rent situation while I moved somewhere that required less upkeep and less financial responsibility. She said the word everyone slowly, like she wanted me to hear it as a team. I looked at Dan. He was looking at his plate. I said very quietly that this was my home, that Gerald and I had paid it off 20 years ago, that I had no debt, no financial strain, and no interest in selling. I said I would appreciate it if the subject was dropped. Claire looked at me for a moment, then smiled in a way that didn't touch her eyes and said, "Of course, whenever you're ready," as if the decision had already been made and we were just waiting on timing. That night after they left, I stood in the kitchen and washed the dishes and listened to the quiet of the house and felt the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. Not quite fear, not quite anger, something harder and more deliberate, a kind of watchfulness. I called my friend Linda the next morning. Linda had been my closest friend since we met at church 17 years ago. She was the kind of woman who absorbed information before responding to it, who didn't rush to comfort or catastrophize, but sat with things until she understood them clearly. When I told her everything, the months of house comments, Dan's coached silences, the dinner, the way Claire had said "whenever you're ready," Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Maggie, I want you to do something for me before you do anything else." She gave me the name of a man named Ray Polson, a retired detective who had worked domestic cases for most of his career before hanging out a shingle as a private investigator. Linda's daughter had used him 2 years earlier when her ex-husband had been lying about income during their custody settlement. She said he was methodical, discreet, and honest to the point of sometimes being blunt. She said he wouldn't tell me what I wanted to hear. He would tell me what he found. I sat with the idea for 3 days before I called him. His office was on the second floor of a brick building downtown, above a dry cleaner and next to an insurance agency. The hallway smelled like old carpet and that particular stillness of places where serious conversations happen regularly. He opened the door himself. He was a large man, late 50s, with the kind of stillness that came from years of watching rather than talking. He had kind eyes and the handshake of someone who had learned how to make people feel safe. I sat down across from him and I told him everything. I told him about the house comments and the pressure on Dan. I told him about the expensive things Claire had started showing up with. A handbag I recognized from a label I'd seen in a magazine that cost more than my electric bill. A watch with a particular kind of face that I noticed catching the light when she reached across the dinner table one evening. Gifts from the boutique, she said when I mentioned it. The store did things like that sometimes. I told him about the phone call I had overheard in my own backyard in September. They had been over for an afternoon visit, and Claire had stepped outside while Dan helped me in the kitchen. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. I had gone to close the back window because the wind had picked up, and I heard her voice carrying across the yard. She was speaking quietly but urgently, the way people speak when they believe they're alone. I caught pieces. "I can't wear it around him," she said. "He'd start asking questions. Just give me time." I stood at the window and let that settle. When I finished telling Ray all of it, he folded his hands on the desk and asked me a few questions. How long had she and Dan been married? Whether I had any reason to believe Dan was aware of whatever was going on. Whether I had confronted Claire directly. I answered everything honestly, including the last one, where I said no, I hadn't confronted her, because I didn't have anything concrete yet, and confronting her without something concrete would only put her on guard. Ray nodded like that was the right call. He said he would be in touch. He said I should prepare myself for the possibility that what he found would be difficult. I told him I was already prepared for that I hadn't come to him hoping everything was fine. I had come because I suspected it wasn't, and I needed to know the truth before I could decide what to do with it. I drove home and spent the rest of that day cleaning the house with more energy than I strictly needed to spend on it. He called me 23 days later. I remember the date because it was a Tuesday, and I had just come in from pulling the last of the fall flowers out of the garden beds. I was still wearing my gloves when the phone rang. He said we needed to meet in person. The tone of his voice told me everything I needed to know about what he had found. I drove to his office the following morning. He had a folder on the desk when I arrived, and he waited until I was seated before he opened it. The first photograph showed Claire stepping out of a black SUV I had never seen before. Not Dan's car, not her old sedan. A newer vehicle, clean and expensive. A man was closing the driver's side door. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in the kind of business casual that people wear when they work in sales and want to look approachable without looking cheap. His name was Marcus Webb. Ray said he was a sales manager at a commercial real estate firm on the east side of the city. He and Claire had apparently met through the boutique, which occasionally handled interior staging for property listings. According to Ray, they had been seeing each other for at least 8 months, possibly longer. There were 14 photographs in the folder. A hotel in the city, the two of them walking through the entrance together, his hand at the small of her back. A restaurant neither I nor Dan had ever been to. A corner table, their body language the particular kind that you can't fake and can't misread. A parking garage on a weekday afternoon. Another hotel, different city. What Ray said had been a long weekend in late August while Claire had told Dan she was visiting a college friend. Her hand on his arm in the last one, her face turned up toward his in a way that removed every possibility of coincidence or misinterpretation. I sat with those photographs for a long time. Ray didn't rush me. When I looked up, he said, "There's more." He slid a document across the desk. A printed email, he explained, retrieved from the recycling bin behind the boutique where Claire worked. She had printed it on the boutique's printer, he believed, to avoid any trace on a home computer or personal device. It was a message from Claire to Marcus. She wrote that things were moving slowly, but that Dan would come through eventually. That the pressure on his mother was working, just not as fast as they needed it to. She wrote that once she got Dan to convince his mother to sell, and once their share of the proceeds came through, she and Marcus would finally be able to stop the charade and start their actual life. She put a number in the letter. She expected their share to be at least $140,000. She wrote that was more than enough to get started. I read the entire email 3 times. The room was very quiet. Ray sat across from me and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. What I felt in that moment was not the grief I might have expected. It was something colder and more specific. It was the particular feeling of having a suspicion confirmed that you had been hoping on some level was wrong. It was the feeling of a door closing. Not dramatically, just fully. I thanked Ray. I paid him the remainder of his fee. I took the folder and I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes. I looked at the house, the maple in the backyard just visible over the roofline, bare now in late October, its branches against the sky. Gerald had planted that tree the second spring we lived here. He said he wanted something that would outlast him. I sat there and thought about what he would have said if he knew what had been happening under this roof. I thought about what he would have wanted me to do. I knew the answer to that one. Gerald had been a quiet man, but not a passive one. He believed in being prepared. He believed in having things in order. He used to say that the best time to fix the roof was before it rained. I hadn't always listened to him as carefully as I should have. I was listening now. The next morning I called Patricia Hale. She was an estate attorney whose name I had seen on a placard in the church bulletin for years without ever having occasion to use. I called her office, explained that I needed to discuss a living trust and property protection, and was given an appointment for Thursday afternoon. Her office was clean and organized, which I found reassuring. She was in her early 50s, composed and direct, the kind of professional who listened with complete attention and asked questions that made clear she had heard exactly what you said. I told her everything. The pressure from Claire, the investigation, what Ray had found, the printed email with the dollar figure. I laid the folder on her desk, and she went through it page by page without changing her expression, the way someone reads a document rather than a story. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been managing this alone for a long time." I said I had. She said there were several things we could do, and she walked me through them in clear, unornamented language. The most important and most immediate was a revocable living trust. The house would go into the trust that week, with me named as the trustee, meaning I retained complete control over it for as long as I was alive. No court could compel a sale, no family member could petition for one, no spouse of a family member had any claim on it. The property was protected from exactly the kind of pressure that had been building for the past year. She also built conditions into the succession clauses. Dan could inherit the property after my death, but only under specific conditions she outlined carefully. He could not have participated in any documented effort to coerce me into selling. He could not have outstanding financial obligations tied to the property. He could not have made any legal challenge to my ownership. The language was precise and deliberate, and designed to ensure that the home Gerald and I had built would go to the right version of my son, the one I knew was still in there somewhere underneath whatever had happened to him in the past 2 years. I signed the documents on a Friday afternoon. Patricia notarized everything, made copies, handed me a sealed set for my own records. I walked out of her office into the cold November air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. There were still weeks to go before Christmas. In that time, I watched things carefully without letting on that I was watching. I noticed the new things Claire continued to arrive with: a different coat, a bracelet I hadn't seen before. Small things that told me the situation with Marcus was ongoing and that she had no reason yet to believe anyone had noticed. I noticed Dan, too. I watched the way he looked at Claire when she spoke and the way he looked away when he agreed with something she said, like his agreement cost him something he wasn't quite ready to spend. I wondered how much he knew. I wondered if any part of him suspected. I wondered if the discomfort I saw in him at the dinner table and in his coached silences was guilt or unease or something else he hadn't named yet. I bought his Christmas gift in late November. A used car, 4 years old, reliable, mechanically sound. He had been driving something with 160,000 miles on it and had mentioned twice that the engine was making a sound he didn't like. I had been setting money aside for months, not knowing exactly what I would use it for, and when I saw the listing I knew. It wasn't extravagant. It was practical. It was the kind of gift a mother gives when she wants her son to know she's paying attention to his actual life. I bought Claire's gift too. A handbag, a designer one, something she had mentioned once in passing while we were looking at a magazine together the previous spring. I had made a note of it because that was the kind of thing I did. I set aside money for it over several months. By the time I bought it, I knew what I knew about her, and there was a moment in the store when I considered not buying it. When I considered letting the knowledge of what she was doing change the way I showed up for Christmas. But I decided against it, not for her sake, for mine. Because showing up as who I was, a mother who kept her promises and honored her commitments even when they cost her something, was not something I was willing to surrender just because someone else had surrendered their integrity. I bought the bag. I wrapped it carefully. I wrote her name on the tag in my best handwriting. I spent the week before Christmas cooking, not because it felt festive, but because it was the thing I knew how to do, and doing it gave me something to put my hands on. Roast chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans and homemade rolls and a pie from Gerald's mother's recipe that I made every year without fail, because some things you keep doing even when the reason for them has changed shape. I set the table with the good china, folded the napkins the way I had learned from my own mother, put candles on the mantel and lit the tree, and stood back and looked at the living room and thought, this is the last Christmas that thing in the corner is going to be sitting here with that smile on her face. And I felt something that was not quite satisfaction but was in its general neighborhood. They arrived at 6. Claire walked in first the way she always did, a beat ahead of Dan like she had somewhere to be and he was following. She was wearing a deep green dress and her hair was done, and she scanned the room as she always did, not quickly or obviously, but with that particular attention that I had long since stopped pretending was admiration. She was calculating something. She was always calculating something. Dan came in right behind her and hugged me in the entryway. He smelled like his father's old aftershave, which he had started wearing again after Gerald died and never stopped. I held onto the hug a little longer than usual. He didn't pull back early. That meant something. We had dinner at the kitchen table. I had set it the same way I always set it for holidays, with the good cloth and the candles and the particular serving dishes that only came out for occasions. The chicken was perfect. The rolls were perfect. Everything I put on that table was as good as anything I had ever cooked, and I did not do that by accident. Dinner was pleasant on the surface. Dan talked about a project at work, something going well, something he was proud of. I asked questions and meant them. Claire talked about the boutique, a new line they were carrying, an event they were planning for the new year. She was charming in the practiced way she always was when she needed to be, and I listened to every word while behind my eyes I kept my own counsel. After dinner, we moved to the living room. I put on the music I always put on, familiar and quiet, the kind that fills space without demanding attention. The tree was lit. The fire was going. It looked like Christmas. It felt like the setup for something else. I handed Dan his gift first. He opened the outer box, found the smaller box inside, and when he opened that one and saw the key fob, his face went entirely open for a moment. Not the controlled, slightly guarded expression he had been wearing for the better part of a year. Just his actual face, the one I knew. He laughed and looked at me and said, "Mom," and then said it again, and I waved him off and told him it had high miles, but it ran well, and he should get the belts checked in the spring. He hugged me for a long time. Claire opened her gift next. She removed the tissue paper carefully, the way she removed everything, precisely and without apparent enthusiasm, and lifted the bag out of the box and held it for a moment and then turned it to look at the label. Her expression did what it always did with gifts. It registered, cataloged, filed. She took her phone out and photographed it and said, "Oh wow, how lovely." She set it on the cushion beside her without any further acknowledgement, and that was the end of that. I sat back in my chair and waited. I knew what was coming. I had known since October, but knowing something is coming and experiencing it are different things, and when Dan cleared his throat and looked at the carpet and said what he said, it still landed with weight. He said they hadn't gotten me anything this year. He said it carefully, like a man reading from a script he was not fully comfortable with. Claire had felt, he said, that I needed to learn to give without expecting anything in return. He got to the end of it and looked up briefly, and then looked back down again. Claire was sitting with her arms crossed and a small, deliberate smile on her face, the smile of someone who believes they have just won something. I sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled, the music played, the tree threw soft light across the room, and then I said very calmly that since we were doing lessons tonight, I had one more gift I wanted to share. I reached into the bag beside my chair, and I placed the envelope on the coffee table. Claire's expression shifted immediately, not dramatically, just at the edges, a tightening, a recalculation. She looked at the envelope the way you look at something when you already know it could hurt you. She reached for it before Dan did. The first photograph came out, and the smile left her face so completely and so fast that for a moment she just looked blank. She stared at it, a full 2 or 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Then she pushed pushed it toward Dan without looking at him. Dan took it slowly. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment, and I watched something move through him. Confusion first, then the beginning of recognition, then the particular stillness that comes before understanding. He went through the photographs one by one. He did not speak. He did not ask me to explain what he was looking at. He went through all 14 of them in the same careful silence, the way someone reads a document they cannot afford to misunderstand. When he reached the last one, he set the stack down on the coffee table and stared at it for a moment. Then I handed him the printed email. He took it. He read it slowly, more slowly than the photographs, because words require a different kind of processing than images. I watched his lips move slightly on one line. I watched his hands, which had been steady, develop a slight tremor near the end of the second paragraph. He read the part about the $140,000. He read the part about stopping the charade. He read the part about their actual life. He set the email down. He looked at Claire. Claire began talking immediately. The voice she used was not the voice she used over dinner. It was faster and higher, and stripped of its usual smoothness. She said the photographs were not what they looked like. She said I had clearly been filling Dan's head with paranoid stories for months. She said the email was taken out of context. She said she had been trying to help, trying to think about their financial future, and now his mother had hired someone to spy on her and was using whatever that person had dug up to destroy their marriage. She was talking at Dan, but she was watching me. Dan stood up. He did it slowly, the way someone moves when they are very tired and very certain at the same time. He stood up from the couch and he looked at Claire and he said, "Get out." She stopped talking. He said it again, "Get out." She shifted tactics. Her voice changed again, back toward something more controlled, and she started talking about what she was owed, about what a lawyer would say, about the shared bank account and the lease on their apartment. Dan said it a third time, and the third time there was nothing in his voice except the decision. Claire picked up her coat from the arm of the couch. She said something under her breath that I didn't catch and didn't try to. She picked up the designer bag I had bought her, which I found interesting, and she walked to the door and she opened it and she slammed it behind her with a force that shook the window glass and sent a small ornament swinging on its hook. The music was still playing. Dan stood where he was for a moment. Then he sat back down on the couch and he put both hands over his face. I stayed in my chair. I did not move toward him yet. Sometimes the right thing is to let the shock settle before you try to reach through it. Gerald had taught me that, actually. That grief and shock have their own timing, and the worst thing you can do is interrupt them with comfort that arrives too quickly to be trusted. After a while, Dan took his hands down from his face and looked at the fire. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how it had gotten that far. He said he kept telling himself that things were fine, that Claire was just direct, that her suggestions about the house were coming from a practical place. He said he had noticed things, small things, inconsistencies, moments that didn't add up, and that he had explained them away because he did not want to look at what they added up to. He said he was sorry for the things he had said to me over the past year, for the condo listings he had brought over, for the reverse mortgage conversation. He said he had known, somewhere underneath, that those conversations weren't coming from him, but he had let them come through him anyway, and he was sorry for that. I moved to the couch then. I sat beside him. I put my hand on his back, flat and steady, the way I used to when he was a boy and something had gone wrong at school and he needed to feel that someone was there without needing to be told everything was okay. I told him that people did that when you loved someone and they asked you to look away from something, you found ways to do it because the alternative was too large to hold. I told him it did not make him a bad person. It made him someone who had been in a situation designed to confuse him with a person who had been careful about it. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and stared at the carpet for a while. He asked me how long I had known. I told him I had suspected something in September, that I had been certain since October, that I had spent the time between then and now making sure the house was protected and making sure I understood everything fully before I said a word. He asked if I had talked to a lawyer. I said I had. He asked if the house was okay. I said the house was fine, that it would remain fine, that no one was going to take it. He let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and tired. Outside, the snow had been falling for a while. I hadn't noticed exactly when it had started. It was coming down soft and steady, the kind that settles without drama, the kind that makes everything look quieter and more still than it actually is. We sat there for a long time, the two of us, in the house where he had grown up and where his father had lived and where I intended to continue living for as long as I was standing. The fire burned down slowly. The music played through to the end of the album and stopped. At some point, Dan got up and made tea. He came back with 2 cups and set one in front of me without asking how I took it, because he had known how I took it his entire life. We drank the tea, and we didn't fill the silence with anything that didn't need to be said. Later, when he finally stood to leave, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression I recognized. I had seen it on his father's face many times. It was the face of a man who has just seen something clearly that he had been avoiding and is trying to decide what to do with the weight of that clarity. He said he would figure out the rest. The apartment, the legal things, the process of coming undone from a marriage that had been built on something that was never what it appeared. He said he would figure it all out and that he would call me tomorrow. I said I knew he would. I stood at the front door and watched him pull out of the driveway in the new car. The snow was still coming down. The street was quiet. The maple in the backyard was invisible in the dark, but I knew it was there, the way you know certain things are there even when you can't see them. by memory, by trust, by the simple fact that some things root themselves deeply enough that weather can't move them. I closed the door. I walked back through the living room and turned off the tree and blew out the candles one by one. I carried the dishes to the kitchen and ran the water hot and stood at the sink and washed everything slowly, the way I always wash dishes at the end of a long day, not rushing, not thinking about anything more complicated than the task in front of me. When I was done, I dried my hands and turned off the kitchen light. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. The house was quiet. The good kind of quiet. The kind that belongs to a place rather than being imposed on it. I walked upstairs. I went to bed. And for the first time in a very long time, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night with that particular weight sitting on my chest. The one that comes when you know something is wrong but haven't yet done what needs to be done about it. It was gone now. The house was mine. My son was on his way back to himself. The snow was falling on the maple in the backyard and on the street and on the roof that Gerald had fixed himself in the summer of our 3rd year here, sweating through his shirt on a Saturday afternoon while I handed him shingles from the ladder. Some things you keep, some things you protect. Some things are worth every difficult, careful, deliberate step it takes to hold on to them. I had learned that a long time ago. I had just needed one more Christmas to prove it.